Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Simon Timpley from the International Food Safety and Quality Network. I'd like to welcome you to edition 29 of our weekly webinar series, Food Safety Fridays. I'm delighted to say today we're joined by Thomas Dunn, Managing Director at Flex Technology LLC. Tom's going to be talking about a very complex but important subject today. And it's food packaging compliance. It's very important that we have safe and legal packaging. Not a lot of people understand it, so Tom's going to be decoding that for us today and hopefully simplifying it for us. We've got about 650 people registered for today's webinar, which is great. So that tells you what kind of importance people place on this subject. Quickly like to thank the sponsors, Trace Analytics, IFS, FSSC and Safe Food 360 for helping to bring these webinars for you free of charge each week, and delivering a free certificate for attendance as well, which is nice. Okay, I think Tom's with us in an airport somewhere in the United States. Hi, Tom.
Good morning.
It's nice to have you with us again. Thanks. We were cutting it a bit fine, weren't we, Tom? But we've managed to get to you.
Ready to share?
No, I'm just saying. No, it's fine, Tom. I was just saying hello, Tom. That's all. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, I can.
I'll come. It's fine with your slides up. I'll come back to you shortly. Just to say, next week we have a webinar again about food packaging. I'm loading that in the sidebar as we speak. Next week's webinar is, let me just load that, sorry. Food packaging and GFSI standards requirements for compliance, and that's with Karen Leacock Bingham. She's Senior Project Manager, Consulting and Technical Services at NSF International. So Karen will be decoding the various GFSI standards for food and beverage packaging manufacturers, which will help us in our decision-making and certification attainment to enable us to achieve business success. So the theme will be packaging again next week. So obviously we've got a lot of packaging people here today. Just click the sign me up button. That'll open a new window and you can just enter your email and name. You'll be registered. Even if you can't attend live, please do register, and then you will get access to the recording, slides and the certificate. Okay. Today's webinar is being recorded, just to let you know. A couple of days, in fact, probably later today or tomorrow, we'll send an email to all registrants with the recording, the slides and the certificate. So don't worry if you miss anything today. I'll be back for the Q&A later. But for now, we'll head over to Tom. Hi, Tom. I was just saying before, sorry, that you're in an airport. You've just got off a plane, and we've cut it a little bit fine, but we've managed to get hooked up, which is great. But it's nice to have you with us, Tom.
Great.
If you can get your slides up now, then we can start the presentation, and I'll be back for the Q&A later. Okay, Tom, it's over to you.
We're good. Okay, thank you. Good day, everyone. As Simon suggested, food packaging material compliance for the European Union and the United States is a complex subject. My objective today is to take a complex subject and make it simple and understandable for practitioners in the packaging production and packaging using industries, not in a full legal sense, but in a more practical understanding of the details involved. So for the content of today's presentation, I want to look at what's the same between the European Union and the United States. And I say same, but they're the kind of things that are the oxymoronic same but different. Similar, I guess, is a better word than same. And then look at some critical differences in the compliance area. I divide that into two subcategories. The substantive compliance, which have to do with basically the fitness for use of the materials involved in a given packaging article. And then secondly, the procedural details of compliance, which are quite different in the EU compared to the US and make all the difference in the world between a successful business enterprise and a disappointed customer, or disappointment in the marketplace, or disappointment in the financial objectives of the organization. And finally, some of my suggestions on how to manage these issues in the ongoing conduct of manufacturing packaging materials and specifying them for your food products. I looked at a lot of different food packaging laws around the world, and I'm struck by the commonality in all of them that goes back to what is considered the Hippocratic Oath, summarized as primum non nocere in Latin, which is interesting because Hippocrates was from Greece and probably never spoke Latin, but the evolution of the importance of the Latin language in the classic education of doctors has given us primum non nocere as the standard for the Hippocratic Oath. So above all, do no harm is what we're trying to do with any compliance of packaging materials for different governmental requirements. In the European Union and the United States, there are some basic foundation laws that need to be understood in terms of I think more importantly, in terms of their legal enabling of the detail that follows on, that establishes the specific checkpoints for regulatory compliance and procedural compliance that are necessary in the different jurisdictions. In the European Union, the framework legislation is Regulation EC number 1935/2004. The regulation seeks to ensure the effective functioning of the internal market of the European nations in relation to materials and articles intended to come into contact directly or indirectly with food. The critical point in the legislation is the concept of materials and articles. Materials in this case are typically tangible commercial type products that are exchanged in industry as value-added products rather than as natural commodities. If the material has what in the US would be a CAS number, or the comparable European chemical registry number, the product is considered a substance rather than a material or an article. And the definitions will become very telling going forward into the regulatory compliance area. And secondly, for the framework legislation in Europe, while providing the basis for a high level of protection of human health and the interest of consumers. The United States has a very different foundation legislation for its governance of packaging materials in the delivery of food to the marketplace. The Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act actually goes back to the early part of the 20th century. It's been amended and modified and regulatorily refreshed, if you will, many times over the course of the last century. But the core of food packaging law in the United States is the notion of a food additive, which is part of this legal reference. USC refers to US Code, Chapter 21, Section 9, Paragraph 321, which defines a food additive as a substance whose use results or may reasonably be expected to result directly or indirectly in its becoming a component or otherwise affecting the characteristics of any food. And that goes on to expand that definition to indicate that that includes any substance intended for use in packaging. So there we have the third term in this critical packaging compliance world, substance, distinct from the reference in the European regulation to materials and articles. So the sort of bottom line is of the packaging regulatory framework in the United States is to the effect that a material component, substance, if you will, has a reasonable chance of becoming part of the food inside that package. The Food and Drug Administration does not have any legal jurisdiction to do anything to either prevent or to approve the use of that substance in the food packaging application. back to the details of the European framework legislation. The framework legislation requires good manufacturing practices to avoid transfer of constituents in quantities that endanger health, unacceptably change the composition of the food, or deteriorate the flavor and aroma characteristics of the food. And it also allows for specific measures for groups of materials and articles. Those measures will consist of authorized lists of component substances, typically called the positive list, and these are substances which have a relatively well-defined chemical identity and probably a chemical identification number in one register or the other. The framework legislation envisions overall migration limits for packaging materials and articles, which represents the mass transfer of anything in that material from the material to a food that would be in the package, as measured by one or another of various laboratory simulations of that package and food product interaction in the course of delivering the product to the marketplace. Similar to OMLs in concept, but very different in quantitative definition, are specific migration limits. These are migration limits in terms of the specific substance itself and how much of that substance can leave the packaging material and go into the food, again under some very specified laboratory simulation experimentation. And then there are other specifications and limitations associated with those specific groups of materials and articles that have to be recognized in the course of making packaging materials for different applications. So those specific measures are not in place for many kinds of packaging formats right now. When they are not present, the member states of the European Union may have their own national rules that control the requirements for those kinds of packaging materials and articles, in which case those member states may enforce their own rules for packaging materials and packaged food in their borders in ways that create specific requirements in that country, but it has the benefit of the European Union in terms of reciprocity, is called, that allows a legal component in one country, according to that country's laws, to be legal in other countries in the European Union by sort of an umbrella legislative effect. And the other aspect of the framework legislation that's of interest is this icon for food contact, which is appropriate for any materials that are compliant with the European Union framework legislation. These are the specific measure categories of materials and articles that apply to the framework legislation. Only the categories for which I've indicated a asterisk here, which are ceramics, active intelligent packaging materials, printing, plastics, and regenerated cellulose, have had these specific measures for them, which is to say they have their definitions of limitations and requirements, their positive lists identified, overall migration limits specified, and specific migration limits specified. And because the plastics legislation specific measure is so well defined and worked out after years of development and accumulation, that the rest of this will be discussing compliance with packaging materials that contain all or some plastic materials. So at this point, I want to split up between the sort of substantive notion of compliance between the European Union and the United States and the more procedural aspects of compliance in terms of the paperwork, if you will. So here's the substantive requirements. These are the result of scientific findings in terms of the health and safety of the public, the consuming public, when it comes to food that's been packaged in various food packaging materials. In the European Union, this specific measure for plastic material is officially referred to as number 10/2011, and it addresses plastic materials and articles in contact with food intended or reasonably expected to contact food. So that includes single and multi-layer plastic products, printed or coated plastic films, plastics in caps and closures of rigid plastic containers, and the plastic that might be in multi-layer, multi-material materials and articles, such as some packaging structures, such as paper, adhesive, aluminum foil, and then a plastic heat seal layer on the inside. That plastic heat seal layer, as a material, is subject to the kind of restrictions under EU 10/2011 that 100% plastic material would be. But importantly, the multi-layer material itself is not legally required to comply with the plastics legislation. And there is a list of authorized substances, the positive list, if you will, with specifications and restrictions on those substances, the standard overall migration limit for packaging materials, and then specific migration limits that apply to a variety of substances that might be found in one of these materials or articles or another. And it is up to the seller of the material, if it's perhaps an aluminized oriented polyester film, which is a plastic film that has a coating on it, or it's a multi-layer lamination of that aluminized oriented polyester film to a polyethylene layer that comprises a packaging article that will be the exact material that contacts the food in its entirety. Those compliance with the overall migration limit and the specific migration limit of those materials in one case and articles in the other case must be documented and defensible by the person selling those materials in the marketplace. In one case, a metallizing operation selling into a printer, laminator, packaging material converter, and in the second case, the packaging material converter herself selling to a food processor, the finished packaging material ready to use with food. In addition to the specific substances requirements in the European Union, there is a very important regulation concerning the practice of good manufacturing practices in the conduct of manufacturing the packaging material. This is regulation number 2023/2006. It seeks to establish, implement, and secure adherence to an effective and documented quality assurance system. It requires that the provider establish and maintain an effective quality control system, and that along with the quality assurance and quality control systems, adequate documentation is present in that manufacturer that allows the control of specifications, the definition of the manufacturing quantities and sequences involved, and the actual process conditions associated with converting materials into articles, or in some cases converting substances into materials. This documentation is also critical in order to provide traceability of raw materials going forward into the marketplace towards the food processors, or backwards if the food processor finds a problem with a packaging material, that allows the supply chain to understand where all of the substances and materials in that packaging material originated in the supply chain before they were actually converted into the finished packaging article by the packaging converter herself. Importantly, that GMP regulation applies to all sectors and all stages of the manufacture, processing, and distribution of materials and articles as defined in the framework legislation, up to but including the production of starting substances. So, for example, ethylene gas that might be used to polymerize a plastic called polyethylene. The ethylene gas is not regulated by the GMP regulations in Europe, but the polyethylene itself, which is a material, is regulated in the European framework of things. In addition, the GMP regulation has a detailed annex that identifies good manufacturing practices for printing inks. And in that case, the ink definition extends to coatings and overprint varnishes and other 100% coverage related aspects of converted flexible packaging. And a second annex that provides detailed good manufacturing practices for the use of recycled plastic into food contact packaging. Both of those annexes represent specific cases where the European Union food safety community felt the need to respond to marketplace events with specific good manufacturing practices in these industry sectors that provide specific guidance to the participants in those sectors for ensuring the safety of their products going forward. Importantly, if you participate in this supply of food packaging materials in the European Union, you must have this good manufacturing documentation available on request to competent authorities, be they national authorities from one country or another, or from European Union representatives themselves. And certainly your food processing customers are going to want to have that documentation, because they are required to have that if they place that material into commerce in terms of distribution and storage before it actually gets to a retail stage. So step back now on the substantive requirements for the United States and indirect additives, which is the generic term that describes food packaging materials in the United States. It's not an ingredient in food directly, which are the direct additives in U.S. food law, but they become part of the food indirectly as a consequence of their presence in these food contact materials. And these are what in the United States are called regulations and codified under a group of administrative law called the Code of Federal Regulations, abbreviated CFR. And in some expression of sanity, the Chapter 21 of the CFR regulations are the ones that are authorized by the legislation contained in Chapter 21 of the U.S. Code. So there is some logic between the chapters of the two basic bodies of legal compliance in the packaging world of the U.S. law. 21 CFR addresses indirect additives by saying that first, they must be made with good manufacturing practices to ensure that no more than the amount needed for the intended physical or technical effect is added to that packaging material, that those indirect additives are of suitable purity for food packaging, and that they impart no odor or taste to a specific food product. Unfortunately, in the United States, there is very little additional guidance for good manufacturing practices to manufacturers of materials or articles in the States, or of food packaging food sold in the United States, beyond this very oblique reference to do no harm, if you will, to the food inside the package. If those good manufacturing practices are observed by the supply chain, then the additives in that packaging material must have clearance from one of 5 general categories of positive lists, if you will. And I think it's the fact that there are this great number of different positive lists that define what's acceptable in the when the good manufacturing practice requirement is met, that the basic structure of the United States food packaging requirements is so confusing. So think of the second bullet point as the list of positive lists for packaging materials in the United States. And I'll try to go through them 1 through 5 and give you a sense of what they represent in terms of a list of one sort or the other, or how somebody with the need to know may be able to determine whether the substances and materials in his food packaging are cleared for use in the United States. So these are generally recognized as safe for direct food additives as food ingredients, generally recognized as safe for packaging use in food packaging, and those generally recognized as safe as abbreviated GRAS in the state's law. There's a set of materials that were reviewed and approved for use prior to a date in 1958 that are called prior sanction materials. But the main source of approved materials for food packaging materials in the States is listed in the Code of Federal Regulations, Chapter 21, Sections 175 through 178, and a special subsection of 179 that I'll show you in a second here. And finally, there's a new list of materials that has limited application that results from what's called a food contact notification administrative process in the United States. And it's worth looking at these in a little more detail. So the GRAS substances, whether GRAS for direct food additive status or for indirect food contact material status, represent opinions of trained, experienced experts that are qualified to evaluate the safety of substances that are directly or indirectly added to food and deem them safe for such uses. And those opinions have to be based on scientific procedures unless they were in common use of food before the 1st of January 1958. Particularly in the area of GRAS materials for direct food addition as food ingredients, there is a movement in the United States to review some of these grandfathered uses that were present before January 1958 and look at new scientific evidence and confirm that, in fact, they are still generally recognized as safe by the experts involved in food safety. It's important to put in perspective that the GRAS list is maintained by the Food and Drug Administration, but it's not an exhaustive list. There are other materials that are considered safe for use in food and food packaging that are not listed by the Food and Drug Administration. And it's possible to do your own determination with the trained and qualified experts and their review of the scientific literature to make your own determination of a GRAS application in one case or the other. And it's then the option of that manufacturer to seek formal review and approval or formal review of that determination by the Food and Drug Administration. The Food and Drug Administration will not approve any of these self-determinations, but they may and will issue a letter of non-objection, which basically says that they agree with the safety opinion of the experts documented in the self-determination. Prior sanction is a very limited list of substances informally granted by the Food and Drug Administration prior to the 6th of September 1958, a very precise date when an amendment to that Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act legislation was passed in a way that basically said that's the end of these informal Food and Drug Administration opinions about the safety of materials. If they've done it and it's a written opinion, they can still be used as prior sanction materials. There is a partial list available through the Food and Drug Administration, but there are file drawers on file drawers around the United States from both manufacturers and from the law firms representing those manufacturers that will have these informal FDA opinions on file that allow them to continue to use that in the present day. It's important to note that there will be no additions to the prior sanction list, as difficult as it is to pin that prior sanction list down, and no self-determination of prior sanction materials is possible because the door is closed on that kind of pre-clearance for materials in packaging in the States. The basic list of pre-cleared packaging materials in the United States is listed in Chapter 21 of the Code of Federal Regulations, and these are listed as a result of an administrative rulemaking procedure that the Food and Drug Administration terms the Food Additive Petition Process, or FAP process. It was a formal rulemaking process that required a lot of time and a lot of staff involvement, and because of the time and the labor involved in the process, it's essentially obsolete now. The law allows an applicant to submit the petition for the food additive approval, but the agency's not going to allocate resources to actually reviewing that application, or that petition, I should say, in any time in the near future. There are these listed individual chapters in 21 CFR that have to do with adhesives and coatings components for packaging materials and articles, things like can coatings and adhesives and coatings that might go on flexible plastic films or aluminum materials used in packaging applications. A separate chapter on paper and paperboard components. Pulp for paper itself is generally recognized as safe substance as listed by the Food and Drug Administration, but all the different additives that go into paper and paperboard to make them functional packaging materials must comply with the lists in 176. 177 is a long chapter with specific polymers listed in it, and those polymers may well be defined by the monomers that are reacted together to make those polymers in various molecular weights and melt indices and other kinds of specifications that are listed in what is cleared for different kinds of use in the list of Chapter 177 polymers. Chapter 178 is sort of a catch-all of different things that defy classification otherwise. It's adjuvants, basically functional additives to one kind of packaging component or the other, production aids that may help the manufacturer produce the materials efficiently and safely, and then sanitizers that have more to do with the food contact materials that are used in the food industry itself and the kinds of surfaces where bacterial contamination may grow if they're not properly sanitized by soaps and sanitizers that are safe to use if they transfer to food materials in the process of processing food after the sanitation has been completed. And then this special 179 section has to do with packaging materials where prepackaged food is sterilized using irradiation. There's a very few packaging materials that are approved for a limited amount of radiation exposure in order to sterilize the products, the food products inside those packages. The last category is the food contact notification in the United States. This is a process introduced about 10 years ago as a sort of streamlined food application petition process. It involves a proprietary submission by one manufacturer who will describe his manufacturing process in terms of the purity of the materials and the byproducts of that manufacturing process. He's required to provide some very specific chemical reviews in terms of the extractability and the migration tendency of substances inside those materials into different kinds of packaging and different kinds of food systems, and a comprehensive review of toxicological effects of those materials used in manufacturing the substance, or the material, I should say, that puts special attention on any mutagenic, carcinogenic, or reproductive hazards associated with the substances used. And then there's a sort of a procedural requirement for this kind of quasi-rulemaking in the United States, that any kind of environmental aspects of these food contact notifications must be addressed to satisfy a special environmental compliance law in the United States. When all of that submission is deemed by the Food and Drug Administration to be complete, which is no small task based on the precision and accuracy of these chemical and toxicological reports that the agency requires, the Food and Drug Administration by law has 120 days to object to that submission. If it does not object, then that submission is by law ready to be listed online as a food contact material for which the submitter of the application may use it in food contact materials. It's critical that just because the material, the substance itself is listed online with the food contact notification listing, only the submitter of the application and his customers are authorized to use that in their food packaging materials until additional suppliers submit their own request for listing on the FCN list. There's an exception to all of these, which is back to that initial notion in the United States of a food additive must be a food additive or else it's not regulated by the Food and Drug Administration. The Food and Drug Administration has defined what it considers the threshold of regulation below which the concept of being a food additive is considered not to apply. And it's based on some very different kinds of calculations where the limit of regulation does not apply if the substance used in the food contact article will not result in a dietary concentration greater than 1/2 part per billion. And that's the dietary concentration, which is a very complicated calculation having to do with the kind of food that will be packaged in this kind of packaging article, and the caloric consumption by the average citizen in the country, and the existing sources of that substance in the diet, just so that the average citizen is not exposed to more than 1/2 part per billion of that substance in the normal daily diet. And the other calculation that's possible to seek regulation exemption is when the regulated direct food additive is involved in the packaging material and it has a dietary exposure of less than 1% of what's considered the acceptable dietary intake. So that if this is a food additive and it's used in the food industry already, the addition of this use in the packaging material will not increase the exposure of the food consuming population more than 1% of its acceptable dietary intake, except that if those materials that might migrate even at these low levels are heavy metals like lead, cadmium, or mercury, or they have toxicological or carcinogenic activity, they will not be exempted from regulation. And all of this threshold of regulation can be demonstrated with a documented self-determination using the right kind of benchtop chemistry and regulatory reference to the kind of population exposure that the limits suggest here. And those self-determination techniques are basically defined in the food contact notification chemistry submission guidelines that apply to that food contact notification submission. In the US, the good manufacturing practices, other than the ones I mentioned earlier for using the clearances associated with the 5 categories of positive lists in the United States, are described in terms of the food processor's good manufacturing obligations. And in that universe, there are some very specific references to using safe and suitable packaging materials. And here's the Code of Federal Regulations reference. And basically, it requires that the materials conform to the pre-clearance regulations that are listed in the laws and regulations of the Food and Drug Administration. And the second point of the food processor's GMP regulation is that he must conduct his packaging operations using adequate sanitation principles. And that's interpreted to mean that not only does that food packaging manufacturer need to observe good manufacturing practices for the food product that he is packaging and producing, but also the supply chain of ingredients and packaging that go into that local food processing operation have to observe adequate sanitation principles or good manufacturing practices otherwise. But very little guidance in the United States on what those GMPs consist of. I missed a page here. So now we're going on to procedural requirements with the paperwork overload, if you will. In the European Union, there is a very specific declaration of compliance that is required. It includes 4 aspects of the identity of the name and address of the business that makes the declarations, the name and address of the business that actually manufactures or imports these materials, articles, intermediate materials or articles, or the substances intended for use in food packaging, if they're different than the actual person submitting the declaration. And then there's a requirement that the identity of, and this was from the plastics implementation measure, the plastic materials and substances used in the production of the materials and articles. And then, of course, the date of the declaration. The kind of materials for a functional barrier, the functional barrier exemption does not apply. It wasn't heavy metals, it was nanoforms of materials that are not allowed in food packaging in the European marketplace. It's sort of a special detail there. The administration of the Declaration of Compliance in Europe is important also. It must be available at all marketing stages other than the retail stage where the consumer interacts with that packaging material. It must provide easy identification of the materials and the source of those materials going through the supply chain for traceability. It needs to be renewed when there are substantial changes that bring about changes in the migration from the materials or the articles, or if new scientific data about the safety of those substances or materials becomes available. And the documentation that supports that declaration, including the conditions and results of testing, the calculations, modeling, or other analysis in lieu of testing regarding safety or other conclusion about compliance, must be available for those competent authorities in Europe. In the United States, the comparison is with what's called a letter of guarantee. I want to look at the first descending of that letter. It's a guarantee under the law itself, Section 303, that the packaging material is not adulterated or misbranded according to the law, and it's not comprised of any substance or material that's forbidden by the law. It can either be a limited guarantee to the specific shipment or delivery of that article, in which case it would go along with the delivery of that article as sort of an invoice or bill of sale might go along with it. Or more commonly, it will be a general and continuing guarantee that applies to the shipment and delivery of that article as so named and identified at any given shipping and delivery date in the future. The important part of this guarantee is on the receiving end of it, where that guarantee must be available for any on-site inspections by FDA inspectors to confirm that the packaging material in a food processing plant does have pre-clearance for food contact application. That letter must reference the kind of food type being processed in that application and the kind of use conditions that the processor expects the food and the packaging to encounter going forward in the marketplace. It is limited to the goods as shipped by the supplier so it does not apply to any adulteration or contamination that might occur inside that food processing operation. And it basically depends upon a daisy chain of pre-clearance statements that extend backward from that food processor through the whole supply chain of packaging, articles, materials, and substances that allows the traceability of those materials if there's an issue going forward about the safety of it. So just to sort of review and wrapping up here, on the substances side, both Europe and the United States have references to good manufacturing practices. Both forbid the deterioration of food by the packaging. Both had positive lists of, in Europe, substances, in the United States, substances and materials. In Europe, materials and articles must comply with the overall migration limit and specific migration limits that are indicated in the regulations. And in the United States, article compliance is demonstrated through the compliance of materials as guaranteed by the suppliers of those materials. And the notion of overall migration limits and specific migration limits do not apply. Procedurally, Europe requires the declaration of compliance, the United States, the letter of guarantee. In Europe, documented GMPs must be available for the producers of the materials and articles. And in the United States, the notion of GMP compliance is very nominal and relaxed, if you will. So just in terms of the living with these differences, most, if not all, of the plastics that have FDA pre-clearance meet the requirements of the European Union plastics implementation measure. There may be some exceptions with things like vinyl that I'm not that familiar with in my own practice. The European obligation for article level compliance has no US counterpart, so that converters who produce articles in the United States find themselves in a very different regulatory procedural situation for materials that will end up in the European marketplace. The low intensity procedures in the United States for the declaration of compliance and GMP documentation are not acceptable in the European Union, and the lack of acceptable declarations of compliance and GMP documentation will stop imported packaging materials and packaged products at borders going into the European Union. So the design impacts are minimal in terms of the design of materials fit for use. The documentation impacts and the regulatory compliance are significantly different. So my recommendation is to consider the subject of next week's IFSQN webinar about the Global Food Safety Initiative and the general notion of food safety management systems under ISO 22000. In both of these cases, the underlying requirement is comply with all legal requirements, supported by the additional requirement that if you participate in the packaging market for food, that you understand what your legal requirements are. And if you comply with GFSI or the ISO standard, if those best practices will satisfy the challenging European Union documentation requirements so that you can issue the necessary declaration of compliance legally and competently. Just a preview of next week, if you will. The notion of a quality and a safety management system are very similar. So if you know ISO 9000 quality management systems, say what you do as you say, record what you did, compare the actual results to expected results, and then act on any differences between actual and expected, and repeat the cycle to obtain a continuous improvement in your operation. So with that, I'm going to thank you for your attention and ask if there's any questions.
Okay, Tom, you can stop sharing now. Thanks very much for that.
Okay, we'll do.
It is a very complex subject, but you did manage to get the key points over. I just have a couple of questions based on your knowledge of both EU and US. Which do you think is the most effective? Because ultimately they're trying to achieve safety of food. Yes. So which do you think is the most effective in doing that? And secondly, which do you think is the most efficient? In other words, for the packaging companies, the simplest? Is it EU or US? So which is the most effective and which is the most efficient, let's say?
Right. I'll say that the European framework and regulations do add complexity to the compliance picture for converters in the United States compared to the sort of the status quo, which is to say that the overall coverage of the US regulations is not as expansive as the European regulations are. But on the other hand, particularly with respect to some things I haven't talked about today, good manufacturing practice requirements in the European Union are much more effective in protecting the public health and safety. And I think some of the new GFSI standards that have to do with the compliance of labeling declarations for things like allergens and other sensitive components for sensitive parts of the population provide a much better protection for the consuming public.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. You know, when you talk about GMPs, one of the big things, obviously, you've got to have a quality, print management quality, etc. But one of the big things is what they call print set-off, isn't it? Transfer of printing inks to the food contact side. So if you haven't got effective curing or drying of the inks, then that can transfer to the food contact side in large quantities. So yeah,
those are the marketplace experiences that generated the special annexes for inks and printing of inks on food contact packaging in the GMP regulation in Europe. So it was not foreseen, but the response, I think, is very appropriate given the impact to the commercial experience.
Yeah. Is there anything coming through in the US related to GMP food packaging, or it's not actually covered in the Food Safety Modernization Act, is it? Packaging, I don't think.
Food packaging, other than the traceability responsibilities coming back from a food incident in the marketplace, there is no change contemplated in the laws affecting food contact packaging materials in the United States.
Right.
But the expectation of the global food processors are pushing U.S. participants to take advantage of the GFSI benchmark standards and basically live up to the best-in-class kind of practices that are identified globally.
Yeah. Yeah. Okie dokie. Thanks for that. A couple of questions, Tom, before you leave us. Luke is asking, can you give us a reference for GMP in the Code of Federal Regulations CFR? Does that mean anything to you?
Right. Yes. They are very. I'll have to try to find my slide here. It was at the beginning.
If you don't have it to hand,
is,
cool. Okay.
It is. Okay, the GMPs are required in the food processor under 21 CFR 130.3D and 21 CFR 110.8. Those specifically mention packaging in food processing operations, and by legal extension, extend back into the world of the packaging manufacturer.
Okay, that's in the slide. What page is that on in the slides, Thomas? Because
that one was on page 19.
Right. Well, we'll be circulating the slides, right. So okay. Luke, you'll be able to pick that up off the slides. I don't know if it's Thies or Thies has asked, what do you see as the current and future role of GFSI certification?
I am very much an advocate of GFSI certification for food packaging manufacturing. I think that the public safety and welfare, as well as the supply chain integrity, are much better protected by those voluntary contractual expectations between buyer and seller in the marketplace, because every lot of material is policed that way by the contractual agreements. The ability of any government, European or United States, to police all these regulations in their complexity and their expansiveness is very difficult. Now, in the United States, there seems to be a a government challenge to the dependability of the third-party auditing process. And I'll take the opportunity here to point out that GFSI is very different from the experience in the United States of inspections for sanitary practices. But GFSI is not an inspection, it is a certification to a management system. And as such, there are some very explicit requirements for the evidence of awareness and management and actions to ensure the safety of the public and the supply chain integrity with GFSI that are not present in the historical sanitation inspections that I think US has been satisfied to call good manufacturing practice in the past.
Yeah, and they're getting more and more demanding as well. I mean, the latest version of the BRC packaging, version 5, which I've just conducted actually a gap analysis from version 4 to 5, and it is on the IFSQM website. Very demanding, and it's got additional, a lot more additional print controls required specifically. So they are becoming very demanding and driven obviously by customer demand and GFSI food standards, flush backwards.
So that's a product of the management system, is the continuous improvement, the recognition of mitigation that's needed for newly recognized risks. So it's an ongoing learning process and improvement process to the benefit of the public health and the economic health of the participants in the food supply chain.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's great. Spot on that, Thomas. Right, I don't think we have any more. We've gone past the hour anyway. So I'd just like to say on behalf of myself and the IFSQN and all the Food Safety Fridays attendees and registrants, thanks very much, Tom.
Thank you all
for your time. I know, just to tell the audience, you've been straight hot off a plane, and you're actually not in a bathroom there. You're in like some sort of room in the airport. So you've under extreme circumstances, you've done a great job. So thanks very much, Thomas.
Okay. Thank you. I apologize for the urgency on my end.
No worries, no problem whatsoever. Thanks very much, Tom. I'll speak to you soon. Then. Cheers. Bye now.
Bye.
Ladies and gentlemen, the certificate now is in the sidebar. You'll be waiting for that. You might have noticed at the top of the chat as well, if you did attend Food Safety Live last week, there was no Food Safety Fridays webinar last week, but there was Food Safety Live that was last Wednesday. We had 6 hours of debate with 14 speakers. Please visit the IFSQM forum and do give us feedback on that. If there was parts you enjoyed, didn't enjoy, ideas for next time, please do give us feedback on that, and we'll help to improve the experience for you next year. Okay, so that's it. That was great from Tom. Thanks very much to Tom. Thanks to the sponsors again. Thanks for you for attending live. It does make a difference with your questions and comments. All there is to say is have a lovely weekend, have a food safe day, and I'll see you next Friday. Okay, take care, everybody. Have a nice weekend.